the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider throwing us $1 a month there. Today, we are very pleased to bring you Adrian Johnston, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque. He's author of many books, including Time Driven, Metapsychology and the Splitting of the Drive, Irrepressible Truth on Lacan's The Freudian Thing, and A New German Idealism, Hegel, Žižek, and Dialectical Materialism. This year, he will be co-publishing with Lorenzo Chiesa, Is Undead, Psychoanalysis for Unbelievers, and has recently published Infinite Greed, the Inhuman Selfishness of Capital, which is the topic of today's discussion. Let me be the first to welcome you to the show, Adrian. Very excited to dive into this work with you. But yeah, welcome.
Thank you both for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to conversing about Infinite Greed. This is, in fact, the first podcast that I have done about this book. You know, you're the ones who are the very first who get to grill me about the contents of this work. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
That's excellent. You know, a lot of times leading up to the publication, you may have already done interviews and podcasts. And as you were saying, the temporality of this, you were writing this during the pandemic, along with the book you were writing with Lorenzo Chiesa. Shout out to him. He was a fabulous guest when we had him on. I know that at least since then, if not before, I've been thinking of reaching out to you to have you as a guest. So I'm very glad that we got to make it coincide with something contemporaneous. I mean, literally launching this week, at least, so to speak, roughly, rather than maybe to bug you about a book you had written almost 2 decades ago. Although I do love Time Driven. I think that maybe it'll come up later, but the investigation of the drive, I think, is so essential and so really well done there. And it does show back up here in a very interesting way, which we'll get to. But before then, I did mention I wanted to let you, as we always do, get a chance to tell us a little bit about your, as we call, your origin story, just a little bit about your trajectory, which not only includes, maybe when or how psychoanalysis, along with, German idealism and these other big philosophical topics, but, just tell us a little bit about your intellectual trajectory, if you will.
I should say that I was, in a sense, condemned to do this sort of work from an early age, in that both my father and my paternal grandfather had PhDs in philosophy. My grandfather was a very conservative Catholic medievalist. Was primarily an Aquinas specialist, was faculty at Notre Dame. If he knew what I was working on these days, he would be horrified. I'm sure he's rolled over in his grave many a time knowing that
almost a diametrical opposition, right?
And then my father did work in analytic philosophy, although he ended up going into the world of IT post-PhD, but he wrote a dissertation on Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism and the implications of that for analytic ethical debates about the is-ought problem. And I discovered in my teenage years, while I was still in high school, books on my father's shelf, such as, works by Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger, some Foucault and Derrida, which my father just, said, well, this is this European nonsense, and I've read some of it, but, I'm not really sure what to make of it. And I latched onto that material. And then reinforcing that in high school and college, I was also very involved with policy debate. And during a time in which policy debaters were beginning to draw more from continental European philosophy, and those things things conspired to, really, ignite my passion for this material. And then as an undergraduate, it became clear to me early on that, I'd already had some exposure to Marxism through policy debate, but
Right.
with the psychoanalysis component, as I was reading, especially various and sundry post-war French figures, realizing just how important Freud and Lacan are for these other thinkers. And then I started, working on that material. I took a course on Freud and Lacan with a faculty member in Germanic Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was doing my undergraduate, Katie Arends, who kind of gave me a crash course introduction to some of that. I eventually wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on Foucault's critique of psychoanalysis, or defending it against, some of his objections in both his early and his late work. And then that influenced, too, my choice of going to Stony Brook to do my doctoral work, primarily Ed Casey, who was there, very psychoanalysis friendly. I knew I could write a philosophy and psychoanalysis dissertation there. And so that's kind of how all of this got started, in terms of how I've ended up where I am.
No, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And the policy debate, we have a friend, Will, shout out to Will, who I think exemplifies that route. And, when I was at Emory, a friend of mine, Asher, he and some of his friends, they came kind of the theoretical pilling, if you will, went through policy debate. So, I mean,
Yes.
that seems to be a very interesting pipeline. I mean, for me, it was like the blogosphere, probably around, the aughts and early teens of the 2000s. So I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that type of community going on. And then today, I suppose you could think of like Discord servers that have rigorous philosophical discussions. So these different little venues that aren't necessarily academic but plugged into it, it makes a lot of sense for that kind of pipeline. And yeah, I guess I did ask you before the show started, but you went above and beyond. And I guess just to let the listener know, you did some intensive study at Emory in
Yes.
their sort of I forget the name, but roughly their Psychoanalytic Institute. They have a program. Would you say a few words about that just to let the listeners know about, I guess this is part of maybe the postdoctoral work that you were discussing as well beforehand.
Yes, I did two postdocs. One had me over in Germany. I was at the University of Wuppertal and was studying with, scholars of especially Kant and German idealism. And so, a lot of my formation in terms of how I work with the German idealist tradition in particular is very much informed by German and German trained academics, so it involves an emphasis on things like extremely close reading, care with the material in its original language, contextualizing things very carefully, historically speaking. When I finished that, I then got the postdoc at Emory to do the course of clinical psychoanalytic training while also continuing to do, my more academic research work alongside that. And Emory has a very special institutional arrangement, psychoanalytically speaking, something that really is unique in the US. First of all, it has a psychoanalytic institute that is still attached to a department of psychiatry in their medical school. So the Emory Psychoanalytic Institute is actually officially a part of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory's medical school. And at this point, I think it is the only American Psychoanalytic Association institute that has an official basis in, housed in a university setting. All of the others are freestanding, even though they might have the Western New England Institute has historically close connections with Yale, et cetera, but, it's not officially attached to the university in any way, whereas at Emory it is. And then in addition, Emory has, on the College of Arts and Sciences side of the equation, they have a psychoanalytic studies program that is a degree certificate for doctoral students. And it has gotten to the point at which people who are very seriously interested in psychoanalysis while in the process of working on their doctoral degrees can even get special access to clinical case conference presentations, seminars that are taught to training candidates, who are doing clinical training, et cetera, and can begin to even get exposure to, that nitty gritty, rubber hitting the road side of analytic practice while they are doing their more academic theory focused work in psychoanalysis. And it's a great setup. If you're interested in psychoanalysis, between all of the clinicians in the medical school, at the Institute, and then various, faculty and graduate students distributed across a whole range of departments in the College of Arts and Sciences who are involved with the Psychoanalytic Studies program, that the combination is really great. It's a very robust, truly interdisciplinary, both, clinical practice and metapsychological theory combination that they've set up there that really does do great work institutionally in terms of producing scholars who can write about psychoanalytic theory, but in a way that really is informed by the realities of what clinical practice is actually like. And it's a special place for people interested in psychoanalysis. And I really got an enormous amount out of my time there. And I was there from 2002 to 2006. Although I continued my didactic analysis, I ended it, I think, in late 2007. So I was doing the tail end of it, a combination of phone sessions while I was in Albuquerque, but then I'd fly back to Atlanta periodically to do in-person sessions, and wound it down that way after I'd already started the job here at UNM.
This is incredible, actually. I really appreciate you going into that. And it makes sense why we missed each other, because I was there a few years later. But I know that by that time, I guess during this time is when you wrote Time Driven, right? 2005-ish?
That was my dissertation at Stony Brook. I wrote that from 99 and 2000, defended it in late 2000. But then there was, it took especially since it became my first book, really placing your first book is the hardest. And that takes, the longest in terms of, having to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince in terms of a publisher, as it were. But it eventually got it under contract with Northwestern. Originally Žižek, who was the co-director of my dissertation, so, was seeing Time Driven as it was being written. He wanted to do it with the Boas Var series at Verso, but he then right around that time had a falling out with them. And I ended up independently making an arrangement with Northwestern and getting it under contract with them. And, that contract came through in 2003, and the book didn't appear until 2005. So there was a bit of a delay, but that was my dissertation.
Okay. That's not, I should have assumed that, but I didn't want to make that assumption. You never know that in between the thesis and the first book, but I guess that makes a lot of sense. But it does show that you were already primed for the program that you're pointing out at Emory. And it does feel like it's a model for something that could take root. It's just, as you were saying, it seems like the American Institute doesn't necessarily foster that kind of, I don't want to say rigor, but maybe that kind of interconnection that seems like much more like a kind of European, French, German type model. But I'm not sure. You maybe know a little bit better than that than I would.
Well, a lot of my training, is from, a combination of, German academics and, of course, also the influence of the Slovene Lacanians, not only Žižek, but, the whole circle around him. And I think, yes, given that, two of the most important influences in terms of my graduate level education were indeed rooted in Europe. It probably is no accident that, this comes through, in terms of, how my work appears, how it reads, et cetera. But it's true that, so in fact, when I was being interviewed for the Emory postdoc, and I had to interview with multiple members of the psychoanalytic faculty at the Institute, I had at that point relatively recently, finished Time Driven. I was in the process of getting it under contract, and they were interested in it. And they were open to the idea of somebody coming to them who already had some exposure to psychoanalysis, but through much more of a French and specifically Lacanian prism, they were willing to take me on nonetheless, and soon after I started at Emory, I got the contract for Time Driven from Northwestern. And part of what my postdoctoral research funding allowed me to do was to really focus on preparing that and, getting it into shape for publication. And the other big project I was working on while I was at Emory was my second book, Žižek's Ontology, that came out in 2008. And I wrote that. I couldn't write during the regular academic year because I had a crazy schedule where, I was, in analysis myself. I was taking, courses at the Analytic Institute. I was teaching over, in the College of Arts and Sciences in both the philosophy department and what I don't think they have it anymore at Emory, but the Institute for the Liberal Arts. I was then, spending time at the main psychiatric unit in Atlanta at Grady Memorial Hospital doing observation. I was seeing some, patients under supervision. It was an absolutely exhausting schedule. But during the summers, when things would calm down a bit, I was able to write. And so I wrote, my second book during the summers of that postdoc. And, soon after I came to UNM, got that under contract with Northwestern too.
That's really illuminating, not just for building that initial trajectory, but it also, as you can see when reading your work, it shows the German side that you were talking about, that close reading, that attention to the original language, that sort of, if you will, maybe the hermeneutic boot camp that you had to go through, that shows through. But obviously the care with which you look at psychoanalytic material, that makes sense that you would have a rigorous background in there. So the marrying of those two makes a lot of sense to me. And I suppose, obviously, and you're mentioning of Žižek as your thesis advisor, we could see that as a humble brag or something, but no, it actually clarifies a lot of your work throughout the way. And so my question would be, and I kind of threw this at you before we started, but I wanted to sort of dig into it more. Do you see then Infinite Greed as building off of these earlier works? I guess that would be the question. In what way do you envision the continuities? I have something in mind just about, for example, your investigation of Marx and Trieb. Obviously, that's maybe a superficial connection, but do you see continuities then, and in what way? And maybe you could even articulate a discontinuity, maybe that kernel of novelty in this work, and that can situate us to start talking about Infinite Greed, which, again, recently published this week. Check it out, listeners. But anyway, Adrian, and respond to any of that you feel fits.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I go back and look at Time Driven, considering that, I wrote it 25 years ago, which is, when I say that, it really, it does make me feel old. I can't believe it's been that long since I wrote it. I would say that I want to start with the main discontinuity. The big self-critical concern that I developed after writing it and eventually publishing it, this was in part a result of the time that I spent at Emory, and in particular, the clinical side of my work there. The main thing I became dissatisfied with about Time Driven, and bear in mind too that, I wrote Time Driven before I'd done psychoanalytic training. While writing it, I knew that in terms of what the additional steps that I needed to take, for my work to develop further, that some exposure to clinical psychoanalysis would be necessary. And, I was at Stony Brook at the time while dissertating, and I, frequently would meet with people in New York City, who are involved in different psychoanalytic communities there in this, unique place for psychoanalysis in North America that is New York City. And at the time, it just seemed as though, the money, the job security, the geographical stability that I would need to do it, I would have to wait until I was middle-aged before that would be possible. And so, but then the Emory Fellowship popped up and was something that would make possible me doing that as a freshly minted PhD. And that's, of course, a big part of why I jumped on it. While I was in the midst of my clinical training at Emory, I did become dissatisfied specifically with how I handle the topic of affect in psychoanalysis in Time Driven. And, in that first work, I hew very closely on that issue to what is considered to be the standard Lacanian position, which involves latching on to especially what Freud says about the topic of quote unquote unconscious affect in his 1915 metapsychological paper on the unconscious. and essentially saying Freud categorically denies that there are any such things as unconscious affects. This involves the contradiction in terms of feelings that would not be felt. Since there can't be unfelt feelings, there are no unconscious affects.
Right.
The unconscious is of a strictly representational or signifier-like nature, and affect is just the conscious, superficial, kind of symptomatic bulge of what's going on at the level of a non-affective unconscious, and it just shows up in consciousness, but is not really, what psychoanalysis is most interested in targeting. My work in my training, including my own analysis, my didactic analysis, led me to find this unsatisfactory. And I worked this out. The book that I published in 2013 that I co-authored with Kathleen Malibu, whose very format is kind of the model for the book Lorenzo and I have coming out in November. The book I co-authored with Malibu that was published by Columbia in 2013, entitled Self and Emotional Life, my half of that was me basically working out my, change through clinical experience views on affect and psychoanalysis as a kind of indirect correction for what I thought was, the shortcoming of time driven specifically on this point. But in terms of the continuity issues, you're right to notice that my handling of drive theory in relation to Marx and infinite greed is very much of a piece with, in many respects, I'd say in the majority of respects, of a piece with that work I'd done on the topic of drive, for my dissertation. And you'll see that too, if you look at the conclusion to 2018's A New German Idealism, I revisit a lot of the content of time driven there as well, in looking at how Žižek uses the Lacanian distinction between drive and desire, and, links it to his ways of portraying the Kant-Hegel relationship. And so I've had a number of occasions subsequently to revisit the topic of drive. And I guess I should be happy in that I feel like there's still enough that's serviceable in my dissertation as my first book that I can still draw on it, despite some of the, reservations with the passage of time I might have about other aspects.
Passage of time, I'm almost thinking that's a pun on based on your investigations of the drive and its splitting. But in any case, I think it is interesting, this question of affect and Freud. I won't delay us too much on this, but Freud himself ruminates on a turn of phrase like unconscious consciousness of guilt, right? Like this, this kind of weird, and maybe that's part of Freud's own reservations or own categorizations of this, where to place affect, the quota of affect, if you will, tied to these associative links and whatnot. And how are we to understand abreaction? Is that a conscious? I suppose maybe that's a problematic that could be more so rooted in Freud and Lacan than necessarily your work in particular. Is that kind of what you're saying, that there's maybe there was a problematic that had to be worked through?
Absolutely. One of the things that struck me, so of course, and it's telling too that you're absolutely right. It's specifically when Freud talks about guilt, and in particular, as early as 1907, when talking about guilt, Freud entertains the idea that there's a possibility of meaningfully speaking of guilt as an affect, as nonetheless not being conscious or even preconscious, but having this unconscious aspect to it. And he comes back to guilt again and again from 1907 through, near the end of his career, and repeatedly is willing to at least speculate about the possibility of guilt as an affect, nonetheless being unconscious in certain instances. And that's just one of multiple pieces of textual evidence from Freud, which show that when Lacan hangs all of the weight of his denial of the existence of unconscious affect on this one passage from 1915's Essay on the Unconscious by Freud, that Lacan is uncharacteristically not following the advice that he constantly is giving out in terms of go back to Freud, read Freud, and even read Freud in the German. And it's interesting too, when you look at Freud's original German, his language for talking about affect in different senses is much more, I'm not sure why I'm getting balloons here as an effect from Zoom, but his discussion of affect is even more nuanced and complicated than what you might surmise from just looking at it in translation. And Lacan, too, I also want to point out, despite himself has a much more ambivalent, nuanced, complicated relationship to the vexed topic of unconscious affect than he himself, I think, allows for. And I wanted to bring that out with both of them. But yeah, part of the motivation is that this is also, if you look at the difference between Lacanian and non-Lacanian currents of psychoanalysis, non-Lacanian versions of post-Freudianism, clinicians are much more comfortable talking about unconscious affect. And, indeed, consider it a valid, legitimate, even important notion at the level of clinical practice. And while I was at Emory, it was one of those issues where I realized this is a big, unresolved issue across different psychoanalytic traditions. And it's something that troubled Freud himself profoundly, that he kept coming back to in various ways, in connection with topics like guilt, that Lacan, in fact, I think really didn't do full justice or didn't accomplish as much as I think he could have accomplished in relation to this topic. And I felt like there was work left to be done. And it involved me then becoming self-critical of my way, my more orthodox Lacanian way of talking about affect and time-driven. And all of those things, really motivated me to take up this issue. And I wrote that book with Malibu soon after I had finished at Emory and was in my early years here at UNM. And it was, again, Nachträglichkeit. It was that sort of delayed, belated digestion of this aspect of, especially my clinical training experiences, that was involved in that book, and that book allowed me to work through.
Now, see, this is great. This is the kind of, these little nuggets of insight is the stuff that maybe that's why you got the balloons from Zoom is a congratulations on giving us these morsels that, there's something similar. And this is, again, perhaps just an excursus, but there's something similar when you do your close reading of Lacan discussing surplus enjoyment and his sort of, so to speak, corrections of Marx, at least as he believes. And you kind of show that maybe this is one of those places Lacan shows himself to have missed certain aspects of Marx that would have been specifically on this question of trieb, on a kind of unnatural trieb, if you will, in accumulation or hoarding versus a sort of more historically determined state. But I'm just thinking about this question of you're being able to go against, as you said, either an orthodox Lacanian position or just against, quote unquote, the master supposed to know himself, and point out where he may move a little too quickly and pronounce a little too broadly something that actually would have been inherent in those texts of either Freud or Marx in these examples.
Yeah, and of course, he was human too. Like the rest of us. Lacan had only so much time in the day and only so many years to live, and it does impose certain restrictions on you. But I think, yes, looking at Lacan's various and sundry engagements with Marx, it did become apparent to me that it's a mixed bag, and that on the one hand, there are certain things that Lacan, in his characteristic style, picks up on and sheds new light on and opens up certain ways of reading Marx that we might not otherwise have. And of course, I deeply value Lacan in many ways, including, his ability, I think, to in a fashion that you can see the justification for, intervene with respect to major figures like Marx, and other, canonical authors, and for example, the history of Western philosophy, and really change how you see them, and in a way that you recognize is actually grounded in a careful appreciation of certain fine-grained textual details. But then there are also big blind spots. And for example, I do think that some of what Lacan has to say about fetishism between Marx and Freud is very insightful, but it's limited in that Lacan's appreciation of Marx's account of commodity fetishism, like so many, is limited to a reading of that well-known section from early on in Capital Volume 1 on the fetishism of the commodity and its secret. And of course, one of the things I point out in Infinite Greed is that Marx insists that it's not until we get to the emergence of finance capital and his treatment of it in Volume 3 of Capital that we have in place what Marx considers to be really the purest, most developed form of fetishism in play, the fetishism of interest-bearing capital, as Marx describes it. And he says, this is the apotheosis of what I was already looking at in connection with the commodity in Volume 1. And there are certain consequences that follow from re-examining the topic of fetishism between Marxism and psychoanalysis in light of Capital Volume 3, rather than the standard reliance on Capital Volume 1, which, Lacan also relies exclusively on, and places like that. And, I'm willing to say that had Lacan read, because I suspect he hadn't,
Right.
had he read Volume 3 of Capital, he might have made some of these moves himself, but, we will never know. But why not just go ahead and do it oneself? Right.
This is good. And it sets up, or at least it not anticipates, it went ahead, obviously, into the meat of the middle of your work. But I do want to circle back to chapter 1 of Infinite Greed, which I found to be an interesting place to start, because it does start with pointing out where Freud actually does refer to, whether it be socialism, communism, Marxism, or Bolshevism and civilization is discontents. I think that's a great place to start for a number of reasons. One, a lot of times, my first exposure to Freud was in undergraduate school, and it was that text. It seems to be a text that is, if one is not going to necessarily read a lot of Freud, it seems to be one of those texts that makes its way to the top of the reading list. And I do feel like your pointing out of his reservations is extremely interesting for, and before we get into those, which I think is a great topic, I guess I wanted to ask a more general and broader question, which is the fact that the thread I think I see throughout the book is this question of a kind of Lacanian mutual misrecognition between Freud or Freudianism on the one hand, vis-a-vis socialism, communism, Marxism, and vice versa, that there is a kind of, and I think those misunderstandings could be both not just extrinsic towards one another, but could stem also from internal debates surrounding, as you go into later in the book, whether there is an overemphasis on superstructural questions or an economic reductionism. As we know in the various strands of Freudianism, let alone within Freud himself, there are these tensions of whether it be, overemphasizing, for example, the role of the ego as defense, something Lacan takes aim at from the very start. So I guess I wanted to maybe start there and say, and sort of ask again this question, is part of tackling this mutual misrecognition on the part of Freudianism and Marxism towards one another, did you see that as the starting place for working out, building the supplementarity or complementarity of psychoanalysis and Marxism? Or was that something that maybe came later on and you saw that as a pivotal piece? That's not really the question I want to ask, but I am curious about the genesis of this work, of course. I do want to give you the chance maybe to talk about this mutual misrecognition, and then we can get into maybe some of Freud's reservations, for example, towards what to do with aggression, right? Which is a big focus of that first chapter. Anyway, I want to open that up to you and respond any way you see fit.
Well, I should say, in terms of the genesis of the book, just chronologically, Chapter 2 was the first part of it that I wrote. So, when I indicate, in the introduction that Chapter 2 is in a way the load-bearing pillar of the edifice of the book as a whole, that's not just because it was the first part that I wrote, but it also happened to be, the germinal seed of what then blossomed into this book. It became clear to me as I was working on extending what I had done in what serves as Chapter 2 here, that one of the things that I needed to tackle, and to tackle up front, hence Chapter 1 being the first chapter, was this issue of the still unresolved tensions and what struck me as mutual misunderstandings on both sides of the Marxism psychoanalysis relationship. And so indeed, you're very accurate to see, what I'm trying to do in Chapter 1 is indeed look at, this fault line of remaining tension, despite a century's worth of efforts to marry Marxism and psychoanalysis in various ways. This, residual tension that persists between these two traditions or orientations. And moreover, what struck me in looking at the literature on Marxism and psychoanalysis over the past century is really everyone's aware of the later Freud's criticisms of the Marxist tradition, especially in, a famous text like Civilization and Its Discontents, in which he opines about the then, recent experiment underway in Russia and in Soviet Union, and has some things to say about the Bolsheviks. No one, it seemed, had bothered to really just confront head on and in all of its details everything that the later Freud has to say about the Marxist tradition, and really work with Freud in a manner that allows for not just a quick dismissal of that Freud as, oh, well, this was the side of him that, if we look at him just biographically, he was a kind of, petit bourgeois, Viennese, kind of conservative, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. The tendency is to just dismiss it that way, but not to look at, the actual textual details of Freud's critical reflections on Marxism and work through those as a Marxist. And so I was trying to do that and showing that, look, and also as a Hegelian Marxist, you can imminently critique Freud here. You can show how, given his own ensemble of commitments, that he himself is not entitled to make some of the criticisms of the Marxist tradition that he does, given things that he himself has said, and to read him against himself in this way. But then at the same time, to look at, the various caricatures, frankly, of psychoanalysis that are common currency in certain Marxist circles, and disarm those at the same time. And it's in a way as though, working through both sides' mutual misunderstandings, I think clears the decks in a way for, doing work in terms of a rapprochement between them that is very productive. And the last thing I'll say is that, I mention in the book that you have not only in the 20s and 30s of the last century, you have not only the founding figures of the Western Marxist tradition begin to develop an interest in Freud and psychoanalysis, but you have in the Eastern context, in the pre-Stalin, Leninist Russian context, you have figures like Lev Vygotsky and Alexander Luria engage with psychoanalysis in ways that are very interesting to look at, parallel to the birth of Western Marxist Freudo-Marxism. And part of what I think Infinite Greed does in a way is it's almost like a thought experiment. One way to read it is, well, what would have happened if the Eastern Marxist tradition, in particular the Soviet tradition, had been allowed to continue exploring the development of a kind of, synthesis of Marxism and psychoanalysis, which of course it wasn't able to, because very soon after Stalin is in place, psychoanalysis is condemned as bourgeois Western, debauched ideology, as corrupting influence, and that just snuffs out, psychoanalysis in the Soviet context. And what would it have a more traditionally historical materialist economics concerned version of Marxism, such as what you had in non-Western contexts? Had it been allowed to continue engaging with psychoanalysis, and had, Freud, et cetera, not become verboten under Stalin, might that have ended up looking like? And in a sense, Infinite Greed is, given that I try to interface psychoanalysis with the critique of political economy side of Marxism rather than superstructural ideology and culture critique, I think that in a way is almost like a version of what would have an Eastern form of psychoanalytic Marxism, had it been allowed to develop, look like.
And it seems like that's the other side of the thread too. Once we consider these two blocks, if you will, it seems like one of the theses you make and you follow through up and through the conclusion is this notion that there is a sense in which libidinal economy, if we want to use that as a rough term for Freudo-Marxism over the past century or so, itself could use a reinjection of questions and problems stemming from political economy. That seems to be one of the things that, if we are trying to navigate, I think one of the figures, and this is from authors you quote, so I can't remember all of them. I know that Gramsci maybe is in there, one, maybe Korsch, some others, but the Scylla and Charybdis, right, of a kind of overemphasis of the superstructure or a kind of reductionism to the base, right? So this navigation, it does seem to be one of the concerns is, hey, questions of political economy are and need to be re-emphasized or at least brought into play more directly into these libidinal economic investigations.
Yes. And also, I mean, part of what inspired my focus on, we might say, libidinal economy and even more specifically on drive, I mean, part of that is historical in that if you go back and you look at the pioneering figures in the development of a specifically psychoanalytic Marxism, right? So I mentioned in the Eastern context, you have in the early 20s, Luria and Vygotsky, and then, of course, the better known European, Western Marxist tradition here. You have figures like Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, and, there are indications from authors like Gramsci too of an awareness, of the possibility perhaps of exploring, some intersections here. And Wilhelm Reich, another author who I draw on, Otto Fenichel, who was sort of he had to be a little bit more discreet about his Marxism as a psychoanalyst once he relocated to the United States to flee World War II and found himself in an environment, a post-Cold War environment, where things like McCarthyism are in full swing. But you have all of these pioneering figures in the early development of psychoanalytic Marxism. One thing they all agree on is that the key to this shotgun marriage between these traditions is the concept of drive. But none of them really fully work it out. And so in part, this is also me trying to work out that insight, but in so doing, realizing that part of what makes drive pivotal here is that it is a concept that allows for seeing the interplay between infrastructure and superstructure. In the same way that certain Marxists will latch on to what Marx calls the relations of production as that part of infrastructure that also serves as the Cartesian-style pineal gland for the influences of more than economic, sociocultural influences at the superstructural level. And I think drive does something very similar. There was certainly all of that. But another thing that really struck me is that part of this project is very indebted to, over the many years here at UNM, all of the different courses with students that I've taught on Marx and the Marxist tradition. And I've been very fascinated that, of course, part of why it's valuable for me, especially teaching undergraduates Marxism, is that, you get a sense of, okay, with young people who have just come out of, for example, their high school education, what sort of, to show my cards here, what sort of ideological drivel, what sort of anti-Marxist nonsense is, for instance, the American high school system conveying to them? Because of course I remember, anti-communist content that I was taught, in grade school and high school growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But, of course you can't rely on that being up to date. But what's remarkable is how lazy pro-capitalist ideologists are. It's the same set of objections, and many of them hinge on this idea of human nature is inherently and corrigibly selfish, and because of this, we just have to make our peace with that selfishness and accommodate it. And the best system for doing that is capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. And that of course, that appeal to what we might think of as, broadly speaking, libidinal forces, motivations, impulses, urges, right, in the guise of things like selfishness, acquisitiveness, greed, etc. The reliance on that, and also too in non-Marxist economics, the models of what motivates consumption, what shapes preferences, etc. There's constantly appeal to what psychoanalysis deals with concepts like drive, desire, etc. That are baked into even the tradition of economics, and so. The idea that, what psychoanalysis has to say about libidinal economics would not have some relevance to political economics, which then just, of course, becomes the discipline of economics per se. Well, no, I think it's quite evident that in popular ideology about these matters, as well as in, professional academic work by economists of various orientations, there's an awareness that you need models of human agency, intentionality, motivation, etc. And, if you take seriously that psychoanalysis has quite a lot to say about that, it seems to me it remains very relevant, and that it's only just due to not necessarily intellectually justifiable biases that it tends to not be included as part of the discussion of, all right, how do we think about human motivation in a way that's relevant for even thinking about our economic lives?
This is extremely helpful. And it reminds me, since you brought up the state of nature, if you will, and Hobbes, in 1 second, Coop, I'll throw it to you. I was just thinking about how Rousseau is used as a disparaging signifier from both sides, right? I caught this in your discussion of the Freudianism. Freud seems to be sort of they're doing a noble savage thing, and Rousseau is also mobilized by Marxists to look at Freud as though there is this overly optimistic view. In any case, Coop, did you have something you want to say, brother?
Oh, yeah. I just had a quick intervention. This is probably my only thing. But so just in reading this, and you mentioned this a little bit just as far as like this concept of, I guess, bring into question this assumption about human nature being greedy, because as a somewhat of a fan of the work of Max Stirner, the bastard son of German idealism, right? It's interesting that he would say, this sort of accumulatory drive is like, that's a spook that we sort of want to avoid. And that's not really self-interest. Self-interest would kind of lead the egoist per Stirner to communism. And I think even Engels even writes this in a letter to Marx in I think it's 1844, 1845, saying, if you take Max Stirner to his endpoint, we still wind up at communism, which I think is, I don't know, it's a really interesting thing that I think he's in this really liminal space in this conversation that I think often gets overlooked, but is nevertheless, I don't know if it's necessarily productive, but it is interesting.
Yeah, it absolutely is. No, I fully agree with this. And it captures, you could say that in that sense, there is a Stirner-esque color to some of what I'm trying to do here, which is to, so for example, with the issue of selfishness between Freud and the Marxists, to come back to chapter 1, part of what I tried to show is that, look, one can fully grant from a psychoanalytic perspective that, various and sundry forms of what we might describe as selfishness indeed are deep-seated and certainly not, just historically transient features of the makeup of the human psyche or of our nature, if you want to call it that. But to show that even if you grant that selfishness is just an incorrigible feature of human nature, it does not at all follow that, therefore, the only way to accommodate the selfishness is by channeling it through a marketplace where the interaction between money and commodities allows for the selfish individual to privately accumulate, a hoard of consumable commodities, and that only in that way, can we appease human selfishness? Psychoanalysis, if nothing else, shows us, thanks to the idea of the vicissitudes of our drives, especially sublimation, just how incredibly flexible we are. And that, for me, a future socialist or communist society, no matter how well designed, it's going to be a system in which people are still going to pursue certain things that we could describe as selfish. They're still going to be interested in doing well for themselves and distinguishing themselves, etc. But, the idea that the only way their selfishness can be gratified is if they have an obscene amount of money to spend on a giant pile of consumable goods, and that alone is the only thing that will satisfy human selfishness, that doesn't follow at all, right? Yeah. And so, the idea that selfishness would pose this insurmountable barrier to socialism or communism, no, that in fact, there are plenty of opportunities for sublimation under socialism or communism. And yes, that might make socialist or communist societies look a little less, appealing in a utopian way to certain kinds of leftists. Oh, human selfishness will still be there. No, we have to get rid of it entirely. But I think a more realistic, down-to-earth vision of what a post-capitalist arrangement might look like would just involve saying, we'll find ways to cope. There are myriad ways, and especially since sublimation, et cetera, allows the psyches of people to meet various forms of social organization halfway, that this can be accommodated, and yes, it will be perhaps for some a regrettable persisting feature of human motivation and conduct, but it's not one that would be essentially threatening to the viability of a new way of organizing ourselves along socioeconomic lines. And Stirner, I think this point with Stirner is very, these dovetail nicely together. So Cooper, I'm very glad you brought that up.
This is really good, and there's a lot to latch onto here. I'm trying to think about one of them at least being what you already started to talk about in your last point, Adrian, which is about when we look at Freud's objections, which I think at least when it comes directly, when he speaks directly of whether it be Bolshevism, communism, et cetera, not just Civilization and Its Discontents, but the new introductory lectures, which you also point out. And you seem to boil it down to this one question that Freud has, which you began already sort of talking about, which is what to do with aggression. And you make some really interesting connected points about how aggression is already perhaps a kind of sublimation, or competition is maybe a secondary sort of sublimation from aggression. And so, like, if competition is not necessarily something that just goes away in the same way that selfishness would in this rosy-eyed, Pollyanna-ish, utopian vision of socialism that is a kind of caricature, that thinking about, for example, the question of what aggression, competition, whatever becomes in a post-capitalist society is very reminiscent of some of the same arguments you make about how selfishness, so to speak, if it's taken as a given in human nature, which is itself an open question, but if neoliberalism or whatnot posits capitalism as being able to take care of selfishness and our selfish urges and whatnot, you also go to lengths to show how actually capitalism does somewhat the opposite. And so we can bring in this ascetic drive, or the self-negation, the self-abnegating drive too. And of course, that brings us into the question of the different types of hedonism. It opens up a whole range of things. But I guess I wanted to ask first and foremost this question about Freud's hesitance, if you will, that you boil down to what are we left with once we've equalized, so to speak, or become more equal in terms of possessions or monetary standing. What happens to aggression? Do you want to maybe walk us through Freud's let's see, his question, and then how you resolve it? I gave just a broad overview, but I want you to be able to put it in your own words.
The overview, I think, is very accurate and helpful. With Freud himself, it seems as though on the one hand, the worry is, well, aggression is this particularly threatening to the social order, fundamental libidinal force. And of course, the later Freud, from 1920 onward, of course, has in place a version of his dual drive theory where the two main categories of drive are eros on the one hand and the death drive on the other. And so this idea that aggression, coming from the side of the death drive, is the greatest threat to any and every form of social organization, to quote unquote civilization, Kultur, writ large, of course, is something the later Freud most famously in Civilization Its Discontents puts forward. And often when he's voicing his worries about aggression, sometimes in connection with Marxist references, other times separate from those, it sounds as though in some cases aggression as outwardly directed hostility and destructiveness is almost unsublimatable, that you have this, this dangerous, untamable, potent libidinal force, and that if we, choose the wrong social arrangement that doesn't accommodate it adequately, it can easily blow things to pieces. But the thing that Freud seems to forget, at least implying that there's this untamable, in the sense of unsublimatable quality to aggression, is that by his own account, outwardly directed aggression is already a sublimation, a secondary vicissitude of the death drive, and its primary original form is inwardly directed self-destructiveness, according to Freud. Right. That's right. Yeah. And it's a secondary deflection, a kind of displacement of an originally masochistic self-destructive tendency that then secondarily shows up in a derivative fashion as aggression qua outwardly directed hostility and destructiveness. And so for Freud, it's that at least the aggressive side of the Todestrieb is, you might say, sublimatable from the get-go. And that when it shows up as external aggression, it's already a sublimation. And so that complicates the picture somewhat. And, furthermore, not only does Freud elsewhere indicate that indeed aggression can be sublimated, but then he talks about how aggression is just one of several very fundamental motivations, and others would include things such as, he talks about the need to be loved, the need for protection, et cetera, these ones that would be much more associated with eros. And there are moments like in Civilization Its Discontents at its conclusion where he's honest enough to say, well, there are these tensions between Eros and the Death Drive, and we don't know exactly how these two fundamental tendencies are going to end up playing out and which one will get the upper hand over the other, et cetera. And I think that's more accurate and honest. And that, of course, would involve him then saying, well, I can't just safely predict that aggression in this virulent, socially destabilizing fashion will automatically win out in a post-capitalist, socialist or communist arrangement. So there's that issue. I mean, he allows for the possibility that things like a desire for connection with others, et cetera, might be able to prevail. That's all fine and good. But even if it doesn't, as I point out, aggression can, be able to be handled, I think, by socialist or communist arrangements. And here's where I want to draw a parallel with, so of course, everyone's familiar with the old Marxist thesis going back to Marx and Engels themselves, that at the infrastructural level, part of what makes socialism and communism possible is capitalism's technoscientific development of industrial machinic means for producing more than enough to go around in an equitable redistribution of goods and services to make a society in which everyone has enough a realistic possibility rather than a utopian daydream. And so with that idea of capitalism as at the level of literally industrial machinic production as a historical possibility condition for socialism and communism, I would say likewise, and drawing on some of the arguments in the book, that under capitalist societies, you have competition in terms of sublimated aggression, not only at the economic level in terms of jockeying in the marketplace, but that, of course, as we all are aware, under capitalism, our sociocultural lives at the more than economic superstructural level, under the influence of pervasive economic competition, also come to be modeled on competition, right? So sports, games, various aspects of our lives coming to be conceived of as winner takes all zero-sum market-style competition, but now in a more than economic guise. And it's almost as though that is the kind of superstructural subliminatory machinery that I think something like socialism or communism could take over, just like it takes over capitalism's industrial machinery, rather than engage in neo-Luddite smashing of the machines to pieces. And in this way, we've learned the art of sublimating aggression through competition in non-economic, purely socio-symbolic cultural forms. Why wouldn't we be able to continue to satisfy aggression in that highly sublimated fashion after capitalism, given that we've already learned to do so under capitalism? And so it's almost as though you get this metaphorical superstructural machinery that we can take over as well.
I almost feel like something like Twitter and maybe like Lacan's concept of the lithus would be apropos here, just because of the way that, I don't know, there's something about, like, this is definitely, it feels like this is a way that excess desire is sort of siphoned off in these, like, dunking on people on Twitter or replying to people on Twitter is this way to sublimate this sort of aggression. I don't know.
Of course, the idea of like Elon Musk is helping to cultivate something that will make possible a viable form of post-capitalism is funny to think, but it's very much in line with traditional Marxism. I mean, again, that notion that is in and through the very excesses of capitalism, and once it has ripened and developed itself to certain extreme points, apropos its historical trajectories. It's only at those moments and where we might think, oh, well, with achieved capitalism, we're at the farthest remove from its beyond. No, weirdly, capitalism's most extreme moments where we're closest to certain tipping points that would allow for a viable transition beyond it. And I think this is, again, another one of those. And you're absolutely right. When you think about how people relate to each other in social media settings, et cetera, you see this kind of, sublimated aggression as competition. Just it's pervasive in our culture. But instead of just, decrying it, lamenting it, just treating it as, oh, it's nothing but the poisoning of all areas of our cultural lives by the omnipresent influence of the ruthless capitalist marketplace, realizing that these sublimations could persist even after their economic origin was surpassed, and that might indeed be part of what would allow for us to be non-utopian, clear-eyed, sober, realistic socialists or communists who would accept that some of this is part of what will provide people with outlets for motivations that might otherwise be destabilizing to a post-capitalist, socialist, or communist arrangement, but doesn't have to be.
I'm glad that you went into this. And also, Coop, I'm glad you brought up the lithus, this notion of siphoning off the excess. I think that's helpful for understanding the mechanisms that are at play. And in sublimation. And I do like this notion of a superstructural machinery. I think that that's obviously helpful. And I guess I want to circle back just a little bit to these other aspects that you brought up, Adrian, about the need for being loved and protected. And one of the pineal glands, the sort of, I love that phrase that you use. Just it's very evocative. This is, you mentioned the drive earlier, which we'll get back to, obviously, but it's this. I love to connect it with the drive. It's obviously not disconnected from it, but this emphasis on helplessness in Freudian metapsychology. You bring out that already, that notion is ripe for unpacking in a sort of Marxist setting and should be taken into account in order, I think, to a certain extent. I see this connecting with, for example, your investigations of time and time driven, and the fact that time needs to be thought of in terms of the drive. If we are to, at least if we see the drive as like a fourfold, not to make things Heideggerian, but whatnot, a quadripartition. And if the sort of source and pressure are the, I think you call it an axis of iteration, there is this axis of alteration in the object and the aim. And we could even throw in Lacan's goal somewhere in there, but we'll leave that out for a second. But in any case, if there's already this need to see time at work in the drive and therefore in the unconscious in a certain interesting way, there is this understanding of helplessness, which brings along with it one of the concepts we've talked about with the opere coup, the Nachträglichkeit, right? I guess that I'm curious about, is it precise, or, well, I guess I'm curious about this question of helplessness insofar as you point out, Freud seems to oscillate, again, this may be the oscillation between the eros and the thanatos, the life and death drives. It's sometimes he seems to default into kind of Hobbesian state of nature, man is a wolf for man type question. And yet, as you pointed out, he also is honest enough with himself and with his analyses to say, how are we to know, right? This is an open question about which is to live out. And so I want to connect really quickly this. I did all that preliminary work just to say that this question of helplessness reminded me of your discussion in passing of Laplanche. And I'm wondering about, because you do kind of tackle this in your own way, I'm wondering about, insofar as, Laplanche is thinking about enigmatic signifiers implanted in the sort of subject to be. As we are sort of born, we are implanted with these, embedded with these shards, these enigmatic signifiers of sexuality. There's a sense in which, too, and this maybe relates to your teaching of undergrads, there's a sense in which, too, we are embedded with these enigmatic signifiers of, whether we think about it in terms of capitalism or in terms of the economic infrastructural milieu, we are sort of bombarded with these signifiers and learn these questions of class struggle and status and prestige that maybe isn't a one-to-one analogy to the sexual realm, but there is a sense in which before we can really decipher what's going on, we sort of inherit and are immersed in the infrastructural enigmatic nature of, we sort of inherit it. I brought that up to allow you a chance maybe to talk about how the drive isn't necessarily so ahistorical, just as an economic reductionist base. We might be able to see the id as a reductionist infrastructure, and that your investigation of the drive, specifically in the work of Marx, which we can get to, opens up this transhistorical understanding of what you talk about in terms of the drive's plasticity. So again, I threw a lot and I didn't necessarily ask a question, but I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk about and set up our discussion of Marx's investigations. So any of that, please, whether it be the Laplanche or feel free.
Yeah, well, I can begin by saying that, I think, especially in light of how figures like Lacan and Laplanche develop a framework that allows us to see how our subjective ontogenesis are taking shape as psychical subjects from, even for Lacan, before the biological moment of birth, the fact that, one's, parents, et cetera, and expecting one's arrival are already preparing a place, not only in terms of, for instance, arranging a bedroom for the new baby in the house, et cetera, but of course, a socio-symbolic place involving choice of names, involving all of the parents' conscious and unconscious fantasies, anticipations, expectations, et cetera, that are influenced influenced in turn by this complex system that we're all embedded in, which of course Lacan talks about as the symbolic order. But, of course, if you take a Marxist informed perspective and add that to how Lacan and Laplanche think about the manner in which signifiers start impacting us from infancy onward, that already opens up a number of possibilities along the lines of what your question kind of points to. And perhaps the simplest way for me to put it is to say that, the hand that rocks the cradle is not just the hand of the mother, but in and through her, in a way, the ghost of the invisible hand of the market is there too, from the earliest ages onward. I mean, we are indeed, those of us who live in capitalist societies are hurled at birth into symbolic orders that themselves are inextricably intertwined with all of the literal and metaphorical machinery of the mode of production and the social formation that rests upon it that we are all embedded in. And that mediation is there from the get-go too. Although that's a very simple point, I think really appreciating it and following out its implications takes you in some interesting directions and leads to, some of the conclusions I try to argue for in Infinite Greed. So there's certainly all of that. But with the references to Hobbes, right? I use Hobbes in a way that I think perhaps is not entirely fair to him, but I do have Hobbes's proper name stand in for, one view of human nature as relevant to social and political concerns, according to which the conception is that we are first and foremost individual atoms, that, we are at the, you might say, ontological zero level of the type of beings that we are. If we're talking about a philosophical anthropology, the Hobbesian tradition would be what I at least call the Hobbesian tradition, would be the one that insists that we are originally asocial atoms. We are lone wolves, and we only secondarily become bound together in social relations, etc. At the primordial zero level of our human nature, we are fundamentally lone wolves, asocial, islands unto ourselves, windowless monads, call us what you will. But of course, you have that whole tradition, especially in social and political philosophy, that we could just associate with Hobbes for convenience's sake. And then as an alternative, you have a tradition that, links together, and here the three biggest figures that would be relevant would be Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx. Going back to Aristotle's insistence that we are, at the most foundational level, human beings are zoon politikon. We are political animals. We are gregarious social creatures, etc. And Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx, among others, are representatives of that diametrically opposed emphasis on the, right down to the zero level of our being. We are shot through with the mediations of otherness in various guises. And of course, again, a link to someone like Laplanche, but also Lacan is easy to see here. And with Freud, I see Freud oscillating between these two traditions, right? The Freud who, for instance, to go back to 1895's Project for Scientific Psychology, when he introduces the idea of the psychoanalytic significance of the biological fact of prolonged prematurational helplessness in human beings, that, we spend an especially lengthy time in our early lives in this state of abject dependence upon bigger significant others, and the enormous consequences that has for who and what we are as human beings and as psychical subjects. Freud registers that very clearly in connection with helplessness when he first introduces it in 1895. And you see that when he comes back to this topic in later work. And so on the one hand, that would seem to situate Freud as someone who would be favorable to the Aristotelian zoon politikon idea of we are social right down to the foundations of our being. We are anything but Hobbesian lone wolves, etc. But then at other points, and especially when the later Freud in the 20s and 30s is talking about sociopolitical matters, such as the then recent Bolshevik revolution in Russia, at those moments, he waxes much more Hobbesian and seems to think that, yes, in fact, at our most primordial, and of course, this is in part under the influence of him reckoning with his relatively new concept of the death drive.
Right.
Perhaps Hobbes is more accurate here. And, in the beginning, we are just these nasty, vicious, self-interested, predatory beings. and we only secondarily become tamed and domesticated, socialized, etc. But I think that the weight of Freud's work, as Lacan and Laplanche, I think are able to show through what they do with it subsequently, is much more amenable to the Aristotelian Zoon-Politikon tradition that Hegel and Marx are explicitly advocates of than to the kind of British liberal tradition, is represented by figures such as Hobbes, but he's hardly alone in this, guys. Mm-hmm. Now, I could say something with, you mentioned Rousseau earlier, right? Yeah. It's almost as though with Freud, you get a certain version of Freud is one where you have a situation in which we never actually got to be Hobbes' Rousseauian noble savages and to enjoy this blissful, innocent Eden. But that, of course, we at the same time originally weren't part of a Hobbesian state of nature. But when we get socialized, our social environment is much closer to something like the viciousness of the Hobbesian state of nature, but in a modified, sublimated social form in the guise of things like capitalism. And then we're left retroactively fantasizing about a paradise we thought we've lost but never did enjoy. So we're haunted by Rousseauian fantasies of some sort of prelapsarian Eden, and that the state of nature aspects of it that Hobbes describes were not part of a state of nature, but rather of particularly vicious social orders that we find ourselves in. It's almost as though we just get the worst of both aspects of Hobbes and Rousseau, and that's the human predicament in a certain sense for Freud. I hope that was clear enough. But
I mean, I think that's really helpful of kind of showing. And again, I feel a little bit bad we could say that there's a sense in which one may caricature them. I guess maybe I don't really feel that bad, but it's helpful at least for putting into context this way in which their names or proper names as signifiers kind of works but also maybe works towards that mutual misrecognition that we were talking about. As I said, It seemed as though the way that you were following the literature, Rousseau is lobbed from both sides of the divide at each other as a way of a stand-in for a deeper sort of working through to try and understand the complementarity. And I suppose because I can't believe how quickly, how much time has already passed, but I did want to at least give the chance to discuss the important work you do in showing how, as you point out, if Lacan looks to Marx as sort of discovering the symptom and preparing the way for psychoanalysis on this front, he also seems to be very cognizant of and sensitive to the notion of drive and showing it at work, at least in its capitalist modalities, in the sense in which, he speaks of, I'm just thinking off the top of my head of some of the ones you work through, the drive for there's a drive for accumulation, there's a kind of hoarding drive, there's this sense in which, and maybe you would definitely be able to tell me that, well, I suppose there would also be a properly capitalist drive. It just depends on where we situate ourselves. But you also break this down into two different hedonisms, and also there being from the apologia of liberalism, focusing on the consumerist, qualitative type hedonism, which confuses what capitalism is really about, which is this quantitative MCM prime, this development of surplus value for itself, and not about acquiring like the miser or just the hoarder things. And so I guess I did want to give you a chance to say a little bit about your investigations of Marx and the use of, not just the use of language of Trieb, but this development and seeing drive at work in, let's say, the capitalist, for example, as the bearer of a certain set of values, right? I did want to give you a chance because that to me seemed like a fundamental investigation in chapter 2.
I should begin by saying that, in terms of the thesis that I advance in the book, that involves saying that not only is Marx, as it were, the discoverer avant la lettre of the psychoanalytic conception of the symptom, with the later Lacan crediting Marx precisely with that. Say in addition that, yes, Marx was also, as it were, a discoverer of drive before the notion of Trieb was developed in its distinctively psychoanalytic fashion by Freud just a little bit after Marx. But when I went back, and especially with Marx's mature critique of political economy work, so the Grundrisse, the volumes of Capital, theories of surplus value, that mature Marx, when I went back and started really scrutinizing the original German of those texts, what leapt off the page at me was the fact that again and again, at key moments when talking about things like the general formula for capital is MCM prime, money, commodity, more money, that in that context, Marx literally is using the German Trieb and permutations of it to talk about all of this. And that it's not only that you have this linguistic detail that, already before Freud, you have Marx opting to use the German Trieb here, rather than other terms he could have used for talking about these both structural, systemic structural, but also insofar as we think about individuals following Marx as bearers or personifications of aspects of the mode of production and the social formation they live within, that, the motivation of the bearers or personifications, the agents representative of things like capital or, consumerism, et cetera, that this is Marx trying to talk about, how these things become logics of motivation governing the conduct of concrete individuals living in these sorts of social orders. And the more I explored the details of Marx's original German in various key passages in his mature works on economics, where he's talking about Trieb, the more convinced I became that aspects of it are very much in line with how both Freud and Lacan talk about socially mediated, largely denaturalized forms of motivation, including things we would associate with selfishness, et cetera, seeing that there are these deep conceptual continuities that cluster around what initially presented itself to me as, all right, I'm actually able to track the use of this particular German word by Marx and see that it's consistently coming up at key points, and he does seem to be using it in ways that arguably are proto-psychoanalytic. There certainly was all of that. But then when it came to, as well, to come back to what I learned from years and years of teaching, especially Marx and the Marxist tradition, to undergraduate students. I teach it to graduate students too, but with the undergraduates, you get this beautifully honest presentation by them of just what they bring to the table in terms of what they've been taught about this, what sort of ideas they picked up, from various sources along the way about Marx and the Marxist tradition. And again, we keep coming back to these issues of selfishness and human nature, et cetera. And part of what I wanted to show them was that, all right, well, let's look at, people who would be representative of the biggest of the big bourgeoisie, in Marxist terms, right? People who make it onto things like the Forbes 500 list, the wealthiest of the wealthy. That, of course, the image of selfishness that, my students had is that selfishness is about just wanting to, have the most stuff, amass the greatest number of consumable goods for oneself. And that's what it's really all about. And I'm pointing out to them that, look, you have individual capitalists, what Marx would call bearers or personifications of the logic of capital, MCM prime, which for Marx runs the show. Any kind of consumerist acquisitiveness is just a secondary echo of what is dictated by the logic of capital at the level of production. If we look at, say, people who are on the Forbes 500 list, or individuals who are extremely wealthy, like we mentioned Elon Musk earlier, they long ago accumulated more than enough personal monetary wealth to reach a point at which they'd be hard pressed to figure out how to squander it all on themselves and their entourages in terms of consumables. Right. And like there's a 1985 movie, a Richard Pryor film, Brewster's Millions, that kind of dramatizes this in a comedic fashion, right? Where it's like literally it's really difficult past a certain point with the accumulation of wealth to squander it all on yourself in terms of private consumption. And people who are multi-billionaires, they would have to work very hard to just spend it all in that way. And part of what that tells you then is that if they're the ones who are, in a sense, representative of the logic that really runs the show of capitalism, it's not about selfishness qua individual consumption. Because long past the point at which you have individuals reach a juncture where they can easily satisfy any urge to consume they have, right? They can buy anything for their own private consumption. Long after the point where they get bored doing that, where they can't imagine what more to spend their money on. they keep going. They keep pursuing the accumulation of ever more capital, which is then sent back into the production process to continue to generate more of itself in the guise of surplus value, long past the point where they could be said to be motivated by selfishness in terms of just a desire to consume, or what Marx calls a mania for possessions. And of course, this is where we also come to, like, think about someone like Donald Trump, who's preoccupied with where he stands on lists like the Forbes 500.
Right.
It's not about money for personal consumption. It's about a socio-symbolic status. And we come back to that point of, you can have that kind of socio-symbolic status in non-capitalist modes of production and social formations, including socialism and communism. And if that's what's motivating, the biggest of the big bourgeoisie, then, there's no reason why that same motivation that's moving them can't be satisfied under a non-capitalist arrangement. And, for them, it gets to a point where the money is not really about a means to the end of consumption. It's about pure accumulation with the secondary benefit of a certain kind of socio-symbolic status. They're not selfish in the way that we think of it, in terms of just wanting to amass physical consumables. Using that to get my students to even start thinking differently about the different ways that what we carelessly subsume under the general term selfishness, the different logics of acquisition, accumulation, et cetera, that the Marxist tradition allows us to appreciate, helps correct for a misconception where we model the behavior of the bourgeoisie on our own very different workers who are also consumers class position.
Right.
And in that sense, misunderstand what's going on at the level at which you might say the invisible hand runs the show.
That's a great analysis or unpacking of closed need to infinite greed as subtitle, or maybe that's the title of chapter 2, I believe.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
it is.
yeah.
Paraphrasing Alexander Koyray's 1957 book, From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, work on the birth of modern science that was deeply influential on Lacan, among others, and that involves talking about Galileo's mathematization of nature as the key to the advent of modern science. And of course, at the very same time that both Protestantism and science are emerging as defining features of Europe-centered modernity, in the 16th and 17th centuries, you also have, of course, the genesis of capitalism, which involves a thoroughgoing mathematization of our socioeconomic lives. And that mathematization is as consequential as the mathematization of the study of nature that Galileo is credited with bringing about by a historian and philosopher of science in the French tradition like Koyré.
And that's why you look at where Lacan says at a certain point, it doesn't matter if we look at Luther or we look at, these ships in the Mediterranean, it's when surplus value, or is it surplus enjoyment, maybe starts to become counted and countable. Yes. That's when accumulation can, at least in the capitalist sense, can be said to take root. I thought that was a really helpful. It is funny, for him to be like, it doesn't matter if it's Weber or if it's it's Luther. No. Yeah.
Luther Calvin or some unknown traffic of ships around Genoa. Right. That's and from Seminar 17. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter if you look at a Hegelian or a Weberian analysis. It all matters once things start counting, or once they're counted abstractly in this way. And I think to your point's very good, is that why does this number, and Trump's a great example of this, why is this inflation of a number matter? Because it is, it is socio-culturally, symbolically, in terms of prestige valuable, not necessarily in the sense of what one can do with it. And I think it makes me think in this discussion of Bataille and this notion of expenditure, the ancient ways of accumulating prestige is to completely burn in effigy these so-called goods and whatnot, so there's something there too.
Bataille, along with Marcel Mauss, and the idea of the gift and of the potlatch, et cetera. Lacan was well aware of all of that material too. Ideally, I would have liked to have worked, references to things like Bataille and Mauss into this book, but I had to, with Columbia, negotiate up front. The original manuscript was about 220 plus thousand words, so roughly 750 pages in manuscript form, and I had to cut a certain amount from it just to get them not to throw up their hands and say, it's just going to cost too much to do the print run. And so there was a lot of stuff that had to be left out, but you're absolutely correct that in terms of, I think, especially doing justice to some of Lacan's ways of treating these issues, bearing in mind that he was familiar with the bataille you're making reference to, that's also additional work to be done that whether myself or someone else does it, would be very relevant here.
No, this is great. And I did see you have some paternal duties. And so I want to give space for one last, it's not really a question, it's to give you the open space to, you've mentioned your work with Lorenzo Chiesa is coming out in November. Do you want to maybe say anything about anything that you're working on now that we don't necessarily know about, or something of a future project? I just want to give you the space to maybe articulate sort of what is driving that intellectual machinery at this moment.
Well, gosh, I have a number of projects for the near-term future. First of all, actually, Lorenzo and I both were in Ljubljana last month for an event, with a number of our friends. And while visiting, Žižek and I have decided that it's high time we write a co-authored debate book together. But both of us have a lot that we're juggling, so we're trying to take it easy on ourselves and give ourselves a couple of years to let that sort of come together. But there's been, between Infinite Greed and God is Undead, Slavoj's engaged a lot with that material in some of his recent books. And, we've realized that enough kind of back and forth criticisms have been voiced by each of us with respect to the other that it would be good to just tackle all of this in a book format. So that's one project. Another is, it's going to still take me a few years because the amount of research that I feel I need to do to really pull it off. The third and final volume of the Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism series, which will involve a lot of biological as well as analytic philosophical material. And I, still need a few years to work on that. I'm now toying with the idea of, because I recently in a graduate seminar taught Lacan's first two seminars 1 and 2, and it had been a good number of years since I'd gone back and read this classic mid-1950s, return to Freud Lacan. And it inspired me to start outlining a project that would involve going back to the Lacan of the first 6 seminars. So seminars 1 through 6, before, with most people identifying seminar 7 as, here's where this shift happens. And all of a sudden the real becomes the most important of the 3 registers, et cetera, without necessarily right now laying out my view on that narrative, to say, like, at this point, it seems for the past few decades, the bulk of attention that's been paid to Lacan by Lacanians has involved looking at the later Lacan, so the Lacan of the 60s onward. And what would it be to revisit the classic 1950s return to Freud, Saussure, avec Lacan Freud, after roughly 3 decades of this focus on the later Lacan? And another thing that kind of inspired me in my book, Irrepressible Truth, this close reading of the 1955 Écrit, The Freudian Thing. When working on that, it really became clear to me that there's a lot that gets eclipsed by this now very commonplace sort of stage model narrative where, Lacan takes this turn at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, and you get this new Lacan at the real, and this is the more important Lacan, et cetera. To go back and revisit the classic 1950s Lacan after the turn to the later Lacan, and, also seeing in that earlier Lacan the roots of so much of my own philosophical project. I want to do something like this. And then I've got, a set of essays on Schelling I might try and turn into a book. So these are like the main irons in the fire that I have right now. But part of it is that, this summer is going to be eaten up with the production process for God is Undead. So that'll keep me busy for a while between now and the fall. And then we'll see between children and my UNM duties how much I can get done, how quickly in the years to come.
Well, hopefully you'll, as you said, if you were working on these 2 books that have come out this year and will come out this year, to stay sane, hopefully you can tap back into that and keep staying sane by being productive. And I do want to mention that in November, expect to be maybe even a little bit before that, maybe before Halloween, I'll reach out to you and Lorenzo and offer a forum. We would love to have you both back on to discuss God is Undead once it is nearing its publication date, and we can continue these wonderful discussions then.
That would be great. And what I can do is in advance, by that point, I imagine Lorenzo and I will have at least the galley proofs. And we could get those to the two of you so that you could read the book in advance of it actually appearing, because it's clear that your close reading of Infinite Greed here, I really am grateful for you to you for having done this, because the questions have been really relevant, on point. This has been a great experience. So I would love to do this again with the two of you and with Lorenzo as well. And yeah, we'll make that happen for sure. And one quick question.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I let Columbia University Press put a link to this episode on the homepage for the book? Because, I've been talking to them and they know I'm going on kind of a podcast tour this summer. And this is the first one, especially. They can get this up as soon as you send me the link. They could put this up on the book's webpage. And as long as you're fine with that, I think it would be great for the book.
Coop, and before we let you go, Coop, this will be, did we catch up a week? Will this be 2 weeks? Do you think?
I think it's still 3 because
still 3 weeks.
Okay, this week we'll have, I'm editing it right now, the discussion we had with Jason Reed.
Jason Reed.
Okay, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And then after that, I forget who we had. Was that it? Is that it?
Well, we skipped a week after Jason, and then last week we did, gosh, see, now I'm too in the middle of, but
Bradley McLean. So
we have Bradley McLean.
So it'd be 3 weeks.
I did see a lot of convergence between Jason's book on the double shift and this book, this question of work. But in any case, yes. So Adrian, in 3 weeks, this will be out. So I'll let you know soon as it's coming out. And again, I really do appreciate you coming on and being with us today. I will let you get back.
My pleasure.
To your weekend, and tell your daughter that we appreciate letting us borrow you for these 2 hours.
Honestly, thank you both. This has really been great. I mean, I do these pretty regularly, but this is really this has been an unusually good experience.
Oh, nice.
I mean, no, really. And the attention that you paid to the book and the questions that you developed, this is also super helpful for me, because this is really, apart from the circle of friends who I shared this material with in manuscript form, this is the first opportunity I've had to, get feedback from people on the book. And it's been really helpful. So thank you both.
We're just thankful to be able to, and this is part of what we understand by the happy hour, right? It is meant to be an extension of that circle of friends, Yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit of pleasure too, right? But
yes, that's right.
After the conference, you go out and you sit down around some drinks, around dinner, and you talk about these things. And so let's do this again in November. But before then, in 3 weeks, I will be in touch, Adrian. But until then, until I speak to you again,
awesome.
Enjoy your weekend. We will let you go. And thanks again for coming on.
Take care, both of you. Thanks a million for this. And look forward to seeing the episode when it's ready.
Absolutely.
Have a great day.
Thanks to Adrian Johnston for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.